Well, it's 3 o'clock, which means it's time for another Vinimark webinar. And today we're going to be discussing the elusive concept of South African wine heritage. Now, as South Africans, we love celebrating heritage. In fact, we do it every year with a public holiday. But I think part of the reason it works so well is because none of us have to agree on one single definition of heritage. We can all celebrate whatever we want. But when it comes to South African wine, the situation is a little bit different because there is a thesis out there that says the things that we have inherited, our national vineyard, etc., are the things that we need to celebrate. And then we need to invest in them, and then we need to market them so that we can sell them on a global scale. And the question is asked, what good is wine heritage if there's no revenue stream in order to make more wines that reflect our heritage? So today, what we want to do with this webinar is unpack this thesis. I mean, first of all, we want to ask, what exactly have we inherited in the South African wine industry? And more importantly, should we let our heritage and our past define what South African wine represents into the future? So that's the course for today. And to help us towards our goal, we have an absolutely star-studded lineup of both local and international wine experts. So we have, first of all, Greg Sherwood, based in the UK, who's a wine journalist, fine wine retailer, and a master of wine. And then locally, we have WOSA CEO Siobhan Thompson. We have the Vinimark head of international sales, Evan Alexander. We have the Old Vine project founder and world-renowned viticulturist, Rosa Kruger. From the United States, we have the author of the book, The Godforsaken Grapes, Jason Wilson, who is a seasoned drinks journalist. And finally, we have historian, writer, wine judge, entrepreneur, and globally accepted godfather of South African wine, Michael Fridjhon. So this is a very exciting group of voices that I'm hoping will disagree at least once during this time, because I think good ideas are worth fighting for. So I want to start off today's discussion with a deliberately very broad angle shot on the notion of wine heritage. So I've asked Jason Wilson to share some insights on this topic. As I mentioned, he's written a book called Godforsaken Grapes, which is an absolutely delightful exploration of regional wine cultures around the world, as well as the grapes and wine techniques from these regions that have been experiencing revivals in some of the larger wine markets globally. So Jason, to kick us off, given your exploration of places like Georgia and the Qvevri rediscovery, or Austria and the rise of Grüne Veltliner, or even more recently places like Greece and the rise of Assyrtiko, I wondered if you could tell us what are the common denominators that have struck you of these revivals that have so effectively gripped the imagination of these international markets?
Great, that's a great question. Thanks. You can hear me? Well, thanks for having me. You know, the thing is that I don't think there is a one size fits all. I don't think that these revivals have happened, you know, there's been a number of reasons. And I look at them, there's almost like three kind of competing realities with these. The first of which is some of these places, like you mentioned, Greece, you know, some of these places, you know, there's a sort of natural entree into a market like, you know, New York or London or something, because there's a lot of Greek restaurants. There's a lot of, you know, around New York, Portugal has had a revival, you know, and there's a lot of Portuguese restaurants, you know. And then there's other places like, let's say, you know, Austria or Republic of Georgia, or, you know, sadly South Africa, where, you know, you don't have a lot of South African restaurants in New York. Although I will say there is a biltong shop that opened in the Village, which is very interesting. So I mean, there's that, and I think that, you know, that's something to overcome, you know, in these markets, you know, where maybe we don't know the cuisine. The other is reputation. Some regions, you know, fell out of favor because they had a bad reputation. You know, let's say like, you know, Portuguese wines, you had the reputation of Mateus, you know, rosé, you know, which kind of sullied the industry for years. Or you had, you know, in Austria in the late 80s had a terrible reputation because of their wine scandals or whatever, you know. And then there's other places that really have, you know, so there's, you know, maybe some, you know, historical, you know, reputational things. And that's the reason why the wines aren't so popular, you know, and that needs to be redressed, you know. And then, there's also sort of two ways that these things become popular again. I mean, sometimes it's through the food. Other times, it's just sort of through influencers, whether those are, social media influencers or whether those are traditionally like the sommeliers, like let's look at Loire Chenin Blanc, which, maybe had fallen on, kind of people weren't that interested in it. Then you had a lot of these natural winemakers in Loire Valley, that were making, there was a new wave, and a lot of the sommeliers in the States got behind these wines, and now they're really popular, that sort of thing. And then there's other wines like, Malbec in Argentina, which was driven by consumer demand, more than any influencer. So I guess what I'm laying out here is there's many ways that these, wines that were lesser known or less popular or, lesser sought after, become popular again. They have their revival, as you say. So and I don't know. I mean, I look at my favorite story, I think, is Austria, which became popular, and I think that there was a lot of work that was done, by Wines of Austria in the United States, as far as, getting trade, getting media at tastings, explaining, what was going on, explaining regions, explaining, grapes that people didn't know. And, I mean, now Austrian wine is a go-to wine for so many people in the US. And, it has an outsized reputation for like how much wine is made in Austria, for sure.
Well, I think Austria specifically fascinates me because, as you said, it had a reputation to overcome. It already had the scandal of the antifreeze, and yet it managed to outdo that. And I think in many ways, South Africa has a similar problem. There are certain reputations that we've picked up over the years that we need to overcome, which is why a story like that fascinates me. I mean,
but I do think that, it's true, but also Austrian wine had a bad reputation, but also at the same time, most people most Americans didn't know Austrian wine to begin with, and so there was a bit of a clean slate for the wines themselves. And I think there's always that. I mean, I think, in my opinion, South Africa has a chance to sort of, it is mostly a blank slate. I mean, for people in the States, I mean, the wines don't have a bad reputation. The wines just don't really have very much of a reputation. And so, I mean, I think there's always something to kind of build on with that.
Well, what I wanted to ask you is, I mean, given that you're more informed than the average American on South African wine, obviously, what are the kind of sparks or points of intrigue that draw you into South Africa or the South African wine scene? So what are your perceptions of South African wine heritage, if you had to give an answer as a journalist based in the United States?
I mean, I gotta be honest. I mean, I've never been to South Africa, so it's hard for me to say. I mean, it's not really like an area of my, for sure, it's not an area of my expertise. I mean, and I don't think that's why you asked me here today, but I think that for me, what's interesting is, I think in the market, let's say, like it's like, because Chenin Blanc is becoming so popular, right? I think that there's a natural interest in that grape. I mean, yes, mostly it's from Loire Valley now, but like, I think that has kind of opened the way. I mean, this is the way Americans kind of think about wine. They think they're very focused on grapes, for instance. And so I think that's, if you have someone who's a younger person who's interested in drinking a lot of natural wine from white wine from Loire Valley, it's mostly Chenin Blanc. And so there's a receptiveness to other Chenin Blanc, I think, and I think that's an opportunity.
Fantastic. Well, Michael, I wanted to ask you to answer here. If you think back to South Africa's earliest accolades on the global wine scene, because I mean, we're 350 years of winemaking, but about 300 years ago, we had this international reputation for sweet wines from Constantia. And then phylloxera came knocking in about 1886, and we were essentially forced to reset the entire industry. Given your grasp of South African wine history, I'd love to hear in your mind, what are our most pivotal moments over the last 100 years that have again showed the world what we're capable of, in the same way that sweet wines from Constantia did 300 years ago?
Okay, well, it's a challenging question, and it certainly leads on to the question of Chenin and the Loire, which we'll get to in a moment. But I think that the problem is that, firstly, sweet wines are not in fashion. And if we're going to try and nail our colors to a mast of dessert wine and a reputation of Napoleonic Wars, Jane Austen, and the reputation of Old Constantia, we're kind of knocking at the wrong door, and we've got no opportunity of showing what we do so well in so many other fields. So it's nice to claim that we were the first icon of the New World. We were the wine that outsold Chem and Romani Conti, but actually for a lot of consumers in an acceptable price point of whatever, what do you want to call it, $15 to $50, 10 to 30 pounds, whatever those brackets are. It can't be on the basis of what was sold in the 18th and 19th century. So that very clearly is a useful adjunct to who and what we are now. And even the idea of being one of the oldest wine industries of the New World, I don't think is a sufficient point of difference for South Africa. So I think we really need, firstly, to understand what our essential selling points are. And I do think that that might mean we do have to focus on Chenin Blanc, and I'm not apologetic. I think Chenin Blanc is an extraordinary calling card, but we do have to overcome a certain amount of negative press that cheap Chenin Blanc, certainly in the American industry and elsewhere, has been a problem. And secondly, even if you look to the Loire, Chenin Blanc was on the retreat until fairly recently. There were really famous appellations that were running out of growers because nobody wanted Loire-style Chenin Blanc. So we can't really claim to be the sort of natural heirs of the Loire, and we certainly don't want to be the natural heirs of Californian Chenin Blanc from the 60s to the 90s. So the education that has to go with Chenin Blanc can't be an automatic fit. And therefore, the idea of South African Chenin Blanc, if we are looking to that model, and I think that's partly what we want to discuss in this webinar, is whether we can make South African Chenin Blanc do for us what Malbec actually landed up doing for Argentina almost by default. But we can't make any automatic assumptions because Chenin's got lots of baggage, and we, as you rightly pointed out right at the beginning, come with baggage. But what we do have, and I think it's very important that we have Rosa here, we have old vine Chenin. We have Chenin that is now beginning to get a reputation as a premium white wine. And I think we need to take that view. We have to make it work for us.
So, I mean, I love what you said about what Malbec did for Argentina, and we're talking about trying to figure out what South Africa's selling point is globally. But using Chenin in South Africa, there was a point where we didn't take it seriously. There were moments, where for a while, I mean, obviously it was a sweet wine and that was great, but there was a long time where even South Africans did not take Chenin Blanc seriously as a dry white wine until we did. And I thought it would be quite useful for us, perhaps, if you could give us your analysis on how that change happened for us as South Africans, because maybe in there are some clues as to how we can change that mindset on a larger scale.
I'm not sure there are clues, but let me tell you, because I was directly involved. As far as I know, I was the first person to say we need to take Chenin seriously. We're going back to the very early 90s. At the time, I was pretty much not on speaking terms with KWV, but I did go and see them because I needed their buy-in to the idea. And I went to Wine Magazine, spoke to the late Harold Eads and said, Chenin is going to be South Africa's calling card. It's going to be it because we had at that stage nearly 30,000 hectares planted to Chenin. I said, if 10% of that Chenin is of high quality, is from old vineyards, is in some kind of way unique from a marketing perspective. We need to save it before it gets pulled out and replaced with Merlot, Chardonnay, and Sauvignon Blanc. And Yanni Retief at KWV got it in a heartbeat. So did Harold Eads. I then went around the industry. We launched the Shannon Challenge. I went to SAA, for whom at that stage I was running the wine selection process, and said, we need to have a national symposium. They paid the air tickets for people to come out from overseas. We set up a moment in which the industry was presented with the opportunity that lay in our Shannon heritage. But A, we had the heritage. B, everybody got the plot. Oh, no, not everybody got a plot. Enough of the key decision makers got the plot. But I do remember conversations, Baz Tutor may not like it, but when I came to him in a discussion, not to do with Shannon, he, at that stage, was already quite actively involved in pinotage, and he was doing a fantastic job with pinotage. And he said to me, you're wasting your time if you think you can make Chenin Blanc the calling card for South Africa, because it's going to be, and it has to be pinotage, because that is unique. And at one level, he wasn't wrong. What he was saying is, no one is going to be able to compete with us over pinotage. And he was taking competition away. In retrospect, the advantage we have of the Loire is that we have a competitor. You can't compete in a vacuum. You need to be able to show that what you are doing is not unique, but that it is markedly better or markedly different. So Argentina and Malbec, it's not the only Malbec in the world. It is the Malbec that the world now recognizes. But there are huge tracts of vineyard in France that are still planted to Malbec. The black wine of Cahors is Malbec. The fact that the French didn't use Malbec as its selling point doesn't mean that once you talk varietal, it's not Malbec. So in a sense, we need the Loire in order for us to prove that what we are making is different, more accessible, more interesting, in the best sense of the word, more commercial. At a time when the Loire Valley depends on obscure appellations like Jasnière, for example, or Vouvray, which at its best is too sweet for the current market trend, we are able to give a spectrum of styles, a spectrum of flavors, and a heritage which is at least as old as that of the Loire Valley. And so we need that competition, and Shannon had it, and we have taken it and made it into so much more than it was 25 years ago.
So, I mean, that's some of the things you mentioned were fascinating. You said there was a sense of unity, or you said almost everybody got it. And then you also talked about the fact that competition is a good thing, in the sense that the fact that there are two voices essentially talking on the same topic garners greater attention.
Absolutely.
So
you can't compete against the non-compete.
Yeah, exactly. So, but my question now is a little for you is a little bit of a thought experiment, because we've had a whole lot of history of successes and failures. If you could just reset everything now and position the South African wine industry, okay, we're going to start again, we're going to replant the national vineyard, where would your greatest hopes be? If this is just sort of a no holds barred thought experiment, would you say we need to plant 100% Chenin Blanc, or do you think there are other things that need to come to the fore as well?
You know, without trying to tamper with your thought experiment, you can't have a completely blank slate. That's like saying climate change has made it possible to plant vineyards in Antarctica. What should we plant? We're not having that discussion. We are where we are. We need to make the most of what it is that we have. And there's some very interesting things that are happening. We are, relative to the Northern Hemisphere, less susceptible to climate change. That's the reality of the fact that we are surrounded by oceans. And those oceans have a more moderating effect on our viticultural environment than they could possibly have on continental Europe. So that's the first point. The second point is we already have established vineyards. and we have old vines. That means we've got front runners in whatever it is we intend to do. Thirdly, and this is a much less politically correct observation, but it's crucial, we have labor. And I'm careful not to say cheap labor, but we have labor, which means that we can market what we are doing on the basis of craft. Craft is, in fact, the new luxury. Things that cannot be automated are, in a sense, where the future of where wealthy money is going. It's a discussion that really I have been dealing with at a number of levels, but no one wants an AI-produced Romani Conti. It will be possible, probably in the next decade, to produce a wine that tastes in every single respect like a £250,000 bottle of Romani Conti. But ask the wealthy of the world if they want that wine because of the taste, or do they want that wine because of what it represents? And what it represents is uniqueness, it represents craft, it represents site, it represents terroir, and the combination of human endeavor and human labor. And we have the labor, we have the endeavor, we have the terroir. So we can't make it a blank slate. We need to play to our strengths. We need to say, we need to produce craft wine and charge for craft. We don't want to have machine harvested and make that a selling point. The reason we need to move away from floor prices is what they say to people is that this is industrial wine. And the future of our industry has to reside in craft. And if we succeed in that message, we will also serve the social responsibility that the industry obviously has, and it will address the industry's need to compete for the rare resource of water.
Well, so I think that observation about craft is fascinating. I'd want to expand on the idea and say that in the mind of the consumer, craft is very closely linked to skills, to a particular skill set. And I think this is something, Rosa, I'd love you to comment on this, because we were chatting about heritage and a lot of the conversations have been around grapes and regions. But when we were chatting the other day, your thoughts were all about our human heritage. And I'd love you to talk to Michael's comments about labor and about that notion of craft and the challenges that face us when we talk about South African labor in the wine industry.
Thank you, Jono. Thanks, Michael, for such a lovely introduction to this program. I think, can I start with just one sentence about old vines? I want to link with what Michael Fridjhon said about old vines. I think old vines represent the landscape, the history, and the hard work of people. Therefore, genetically modified and machine harvested vineyards, I don't think would fit into craft, the idea of craft very nicely. For me, heritage means, as a viticulturist, as someone from the vineyards, not a marketer or a seller of wine, that means two things. The concept of old vines, which gives, I think at this time of COVID and uncertainty in the world, it gives people a little bit of a link with the past and a perspective of the future. So it's a kind of stability. That's what I find amongst a lot of people. So your question is about labor. This is, of course, been a subject of mine for a long time. I think, can I take a step back, please? The policy or the whole system of separate development and inferior schooling, like it was seriously inferior schooling for Black, coloured and Indian people under the previous government, has had devastating effects on our society. We know that. Unfortunately, since 1994, under the present government, the status quo hasn't changed that much. We still sit with inferior schooling in some of the rural areas, or most of them. And no wonder we have a 44% unemployment rate. I know that I'm saying might be controversial, but I'm saying what I'm saying. For historical reasons, there are very few government institutions for agriculture in the Western Cape. And most farm workers don't have access to places like Boland College or Elsenburg or any of those, only because they don't have a basic education. A lot of the people that I work with in the vineyards don't have standard 1, but they're fantastic people and they want to learn, and they are so desperate and so eager to learn. The result of our past under the apartheid regime and the present government is we have masses of untrained people with very limited skills, and specifically in viticulture. That is our heritage, but we can do something about it. We can change it. I am convinced that the industry, we can change that, and it won't cost that much. We don't need huge buildings and lots of laptops and technology. We don't need any of that. There are enough very well-trained viticulturists in the field. There are enough older farm managers who were trained under people like Evan Archer and Howard Simon years ago that can actually be used as teachers. All we need is the heart and the will to change. We will have to start changing this. At some stage, we have to start working and developing the skills of the people in the fields. We can sell as much as we want. We can have the most sexiest, beautiful winemakers. We can sell to the rest of the world. But if the people in the fields are not trained, we will never have proper viticulture in this country. And as we know, all social upliftments start with education. And I know there are many attempts in the industry to transformation. The Cape Winemakers Guild is doing a fantastic job. The Pebbles Project, there's lots. And I don't disregard that. I know they're doing a fantastic job. And Vita and IPW, they're all doing good work. And everybody always tells me to be patient, that things are changing. But I don't see anything happening in the fields. I don't see enough people being trained. We do not reach enough people with the training systems like we do at the moment. Why not? Because it's not an industry-driven initiative. We need the whole industry, everybody in the industry to see this, that there is a need for this. Our schoolrooms can be the vineyards. Our tools is our hands and our secateurs. And in every region, we can form groups of people on farms that biannually train people in the fields. Practically basic courses that will improve worker skills, and in that way improve viticulture, and in that way improve vineyards, and eventually make better wine for the people that grow the vineyards. If we can demand Vita farmers to adhere to the rules of Vita or IPW, if we can force them to build proper gifkamers, you know what is a gifkamer? A gifkamer is a place where you store your chemicals. And if we can force them to do erosion ditches and all these things, why can't we ask them or demand that they send people for training? Why not? Why? How can we, these other things are so important and training is not. If we can train more people, it would be a win-win situation for everybody. And it's not difficult to do it. It just means people must want to do it. And imagine in 50 years, I won't be here anymore, but some of you, I see some that might still be around, could look back and say, that is the time when things changed. That was the time, in the most destitute of times, things changed for the South African wine industry in the vineyards, and people's lives started improving. And I think that could be our heritage in future.
Well, I mean, I just think that's such an amazing dovetail with what Michael was just saying about craft. And we have this large workforce, and it's indisputable that notions of craft and a move towards attention to detail and the human touch in food and around the world, no marketer is going to argue with us about that. And I just think it's incredible to think that if Michael is right about craft in South Africa, then for us to fully capitalize on that, we have to invest in the workforce, right? Because then you are showing producers there is this global sales momentum, and we have the people ready to do it. Now we connect the dots, you know, and I think training is so key. And I just loved what you had to say there. I think, wouldn't it just be amazing if, Because there are projects that are doing it. There are even projects that are managing to be profitable while uplifting people. Couldn't we have a clever think tank that sits down and says, here are 8 or 9 projects that are successful in small zones? And as we talked about, the people who are training the workforce, the people who are developing our human heritage are usually small producers. But imagine if these guys could look at the common denominators, analyze what's working, and then go to the big bodies and say, these are central points that will develop our labor heritage, that will enable the South African wine team to meaningfully communicate craft as a marketing message. Anyway, so it's not charity, it's actually about putting South Africa back on the map with skilled labor. So I love it. But sorry, I think that was a bit of a digression. But so Rosa, can we turn the conversation to a little more of our botanical heritage? And I wanted to ask you, I mean, you're probably the most qualified person in the world to talk about South African old vines. You've become acquainted with all of our oldest blocks. Could you give us a little bit of a breakdown for those listening? What are our oldest vines? What are the cultivars? And what has enabled them to last so long?
When we started with this project about 20 years ago, we had 8 members. Now we have 110 or something like that. 6 years ago, when Andre Morgenthal joined, it made a huge difference. We had 2,600 hectares of vines that's older than 35 years in this country. We've now moved it up to 3,700 hectares of vines. So whilst the general hectarage of vineyards in South Africa is decreasing, the hectarage of old vineyards are increasing. So that's already a good start, I think. The oldest vineyards, we have 9 vineyards older than 120 years. We know that. We know some of them are older than 120 years, but they only started recording the dates of planting in 1900. That's what we think. So, and the oldest is, of course, Chenin, Semillon, and Muscat Alexandrie. And then younger is Grenache and Grenache Noir. But what is very interesting is, I think the outside world is watching South Africa more than we think. Because 3 years ago, Antov, the Loire, Inter-Loire Association from the Loire sent 4 researchers here from Antov. Antov is the nursery, the viticultural body in France. To look at our Chenin, they said, well, the wines are tasting so fantastic across the world from South Africa, from old vineyards, we have to come and look at it. And what are the varieties and what are the growing conditions, etc., etc. They came here and I escorted them, and Ina Smith from the Chenin Blanc Association, which I always think is a fantastic job. She and Andre Morgenthal helped them around. So they found that there's clones here. They don't call it clones, they call them selections. There's selections of Chenin here that is completely extinct in the rest of the world. They don't exist in France anymore. They must have been brought here initially when the people came from Europe and planted vineyards here, but then they became extinct in France, but they now survived in South Africa. That's the one thing that they found a lot of things, but that was the first most important thing, I think. And of course, the second thing which they found, which is as a viticulture is very close to my heart. The biggest threat in South Africa for viticulture is the leaf roll virus, because if you have leaf roll virus, your vineyards can't produce qualitatively or quantitatively as good as they should. We know that. It's not a myth, it's a fact. Various winemakers can attest to that. So they found, lo and behold, unexpectedly in total, 3 vineyards, about as far as I remember, all 3 older than 50 years, that's completely virus-free. Completely virus-free. In the South African wine industry, we fight against leaf roll virus constantly. And most of our old vineyards have virus. And these 3 vineyards were surrounded by virus vineyards, red vineyards that go, red wine grapes that go, the leaves go red, and white wine grapes where you could just see the cold vine, the cold leaves. So how come these vineyards escape the virus? I mean, as I'm sure Evan and Jason think this is a silly subject, but as a viticulturist, this is a very important subject, because if we can plant clean, we can stay clean. And we don't have to genetically modify these vineyards. We don't have to use all sorts of insecticides. And we can, if we learn from these old vineyards, maybe we can plant in future in a way that these vines would stay naturally healthy. Those are the two things I think that was for us as viticulturists very exciting. And since then, the OIV, if some of you would know, it's an Organization for International Viticulture and Wine. They've approached us. We now are on speaking terms with them internationally on a committee that is looking into this. Why are these vineyards clean? And what is it that we do in South Africa that we have so many old vineyards in this most extreme of climates? So that, I think, is really exciting for us.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. Clients that are now globally unique. I feel like we should be talking about that more. And also love, I mean, you talked about old vines that seem to have developed some sort of natural disease immunity. And this is the exact opposite of the sort of science lab gene modification thing where you're trying to read out some sort of disease resistance. But here is natural plant material that can be teaching the entire world a lesson about disease immunity. I think that's hugely exciting. But now, Rosa, are you saying, I mean, again, we've talked a lot about Chenin, but I know that there are some other cultivars that are out there, and we can't, yeah, I want to hear about some of the other vines, some of the other cultivars that you think are bringing you sources of excitement at the Old Vine Project and that you think have potential to represent South Africa.
It's not so much the varieties that interest me, it's the way that the varieties express the landscape they're planted in. So you'll find Chenin from up the west coast, the very well-known Skurfberg now. You'll find Chenin in Stellenbosch that are so vastly different. Even the way the vines grow is different. So I think a vine almost, and this is not a scientific finding, this is just pure from what I see in the vineyards, a vine almost loses its clonal status or its varietal specificity. What is that word, Michael? You would know what that word is. Over the years, as it gets older, because you would walk in a vineyard that's 100 years old and there will be vines that look completely different from each other. And the Semio from, for example, Skurfberg is completely different to the Semio, for example, from Franschhoek. And they also taste differently. So the other major variety of old vines in South Africa is Semio. And of course, the Semio Gris that we have here, that's a natural optical mutation. It's not a different clone. It's just an optical mutation according to Vititech. So 1 year you'll have a Semio Green, the next it will be back to Semio Blanc. But we, as far as we know, Semio Gris is specific to this country. I think they grow now Semio Gris in Australia as well, or there has been Semio Gris there. But Semio Gris on our old vineyards is a mutation that makes, of course, a wine with completely different characters. We've made Semio Green, Semio White separately, and they taste completely different. The Semio Gris is for me very exciting, and of course the Grenache Blanc from Pekiniers Kloof is beautiful, makes beautiful wines. And there's the old Grenache there that we found. Unfortunately, the farmer ripped it out, but we quickly took cuttings before he ripped it out. There's a clone of Grenache there that has berries as small as Cabernet. Now, how? Because the one thing about a Grenache, it has a huge berry and a huge bunch, especially in South Africa, and very often the bunches are pink and not red. So this is a small bunch and a small berry, and it's blood red. So we've taken cuttings from that, and now we're multiplying that. So Semio is a Semio, Grenache, and Muscat. I've always found Muscat very exciting. I think and nobody agrees with me, but I think there's still a dry Muscat to be made that is going to kick ass. And of course, then the Columbar and Palomino. Columbar and Palomino is a workhorse. We know that it's you might use brandy and all sorts of other stuff, but getting older, it makes these beautiful wines. And for me, don't know if you've tasted Vlugberg from Fairview. It's a Palomino from Picanius Kloof. That's also a very old vineyard. It almost shows the struggle and the scent and the years in this climate, because it's a very fine wine, I think. And those are the cultivars.
So Michael, can I ask you to comment on Colombard specifically, because it feels like it has the potential to, or do you feel it has the potential to be elevated in the same way that perhaps Chenin was elevated, or do you think it just does not have the sensorial qualities?
Okay, so there are some completely fabulous Colombards. I'm thinking, for example, of the Loferland from Priska, which doesn't even come from a particularly old block and produces a wine of extraordinary tension and concentration. So there's no doubt that if you manage your crop weight, you locate it properly, you treat it seriously, you're going to get really nice wine from Colombard. Colombard carries, in a way, the same branding problem that we have with Chenin. That, if you try and sell it in California, where they call it French Colombard, it's already down the food chain, a hell of a lot more even than Chenin Blanc. But in a way, that almost sounds like that is our USP, that we take these forgotten varieties and rediscover them and elevate them. Because if we don't do that, we're going to start off trying to make Merlot, Cabernet, Chardonnay, etc., etc. I had my hand up, though, before I hand you back to Rosa, and this is not a disingenuous question. It's a core question, and it needs to be aired. And if I'm going to make or lose a few friends on the way, it has to be said. Rosa and I and more and other people have been trying to persuade the industry that training is the central objective of our future. That's not a social responsibility objective. It's not a nice to have. It is a need to have. That if we fail to make the most of the attributes that are available to us, if we fail to make the most of the artisanal potential of our vineyards, we will collapse into vast swathes of wine that will be competing against the same vineyards across northern Spain and pretty much anywhere else in the world, and for a lot less money, because we have to factor transport into the equation. So the most difficult thing is that up till now, the official bodies of the industry have not embraced the idea that training is not discretionary, that it is effectively the most important single survival mechanism that is the missing building block to our old vine heritage and to our ability to convert unfashionable varieties into expressions of place. So I don't want the seminar or webinar to end without having put that thought on the table, that it is an absolute intrinsic. It's not a nice to have. It is not replaceable with AI. It's not replaceable with mechanization.
I think that's fantastic. And I think that one of the themes that has been coming out hugely, not only through you, but through Rosa as well, is that sense of human heritage. And we are here to talk about heritage. So I think that's 100% spot on. But we have been spending a lot of time, we've had voices from inside South Africa talking about what we have and what has the potential to be developed. I want to turn the conversation over to Greg Sherwood for a little bit. Greg is based in the UK. And Greg, I'm not going to ask you to tell me what excites you most about South African wine, because I know you love the whole scene too much to be truly impartial. What I wanted you to outline for us, just to give us as South Africans some insight, is what are the main areas of resistance that you experience from your customers when you're trying to sell South African wines over, say, Chilean or Australian or Argentine wines? Where do we fall down in our efforts to express what defines South African wine?
Thanks, Jono. Fascinating listening to both Michael and Rosa, as always. It's quite a tricky question, but areas of resistance. primarily because there's been so much positivity and goodwill thrown South Africa's way over the last decade or even more now. But just like starting in the vineyards or starting with your greatest asset, your workers and your land, is, you know, it all starts with an education process. And, you know, I might deal with in the fine wine trade here, but certainly the E word, education, you know, is being central to everything I've had to do and experience for the last 20 years and more, which I've been in the UK, having returned back here in 2000. And I suppose ultimately I didn't choose to become kind of a flag bearer necessarily of South African wine just because I was South African, but I think I maybe believed in the wine quality. I believed in the potential. I knew enough about the top wines and the interesting wines long before all the kind of interesting, you know, the amazing new stuff that's kind of come along in the last decade and a half. I knew the greats, and I knew there was a potential, and I knew there was a potential affinity with fine wine consumers with a more classical perspective and palate for the wines they like to buy, collect, and drink. And I suppose I just ultimately thought, subconsciously and consciously, that it's an important journey that I wanted to share with certainly my consumers, going back, you know, over 20 years. And, you know, if we look at heritage, you know, I needed those tools, you know, in our to use to sell the story, to sell the message, to convince people, you know, why they should be buying South African wine over Chilean wine or Argentinian wine and Australian wine. And I have to say, where we are now is just unrecognizable for where we were in, say, 2000. And I mean, that's already was 6-7 years after democracy. I mean, pretty much post 1990, really. But I mean, from the sentiment was very slow to change back then. I still used to get a lot of customers coming in and asking for, you know, mixed cases or mixed parcels of wine, but not South African, because they don't like the style. And some of them, you know, I would persist and say, but have you tried a good Stellenbosch Cabernet? Or have you tried a good cool climate Sauvignon from Elgin, or Chardonnay, or a good Walker Bay Himelanard Chardonnay? You know, it's similar to Burgundy. It can be, you know, the top stuff. And it was really a hard sell. And, you know, so you kind of perpetually scuttling around trying to find what, you know, as I say, consciously and subconsciously, what is our heritage? What are the positives that you could sell to these people? And I have to say, it was very difficult, but I believed in the wines, and I believed that we had, you know, some really unique opportunities that if I could start to sell some of my top clients and wear them down over time and get the wines in their cellars, that I could sell them on the concept. And certainly our heritage that I look at, you know, we had the fine products, not as many back then as we do now. Now we're spoiled for choice. We had we had famous wines, your Paul Sours, your Rubicons, your Hamilton Russells and things, Le Riches and Rustenburgs. We had the famous estates, the state heritage, the state, you know, we often underestimate, people pick on the structure of our South African industry a lot, you know, but they normally then talk about co-ops and, you know, where all our kind of old vine stuff used to just disappear. But, you know, a lot of the industry was estate driven. And on the negative side, maybe it limited production quantity and scale. But on another factor, it really created an identity for multiple kind of soft brands within that structure. And those estates, you know, have become very strong brands across the board in themselves, and which is a great unique selling point for South Africa. You know, we're not dominated like many industries by massive conglomerates, massive kind of brands which are just multi-regional. I mean, perhaps, you know, we need maybe a couple of those more earnestly, but certainly the estate structure allowed for what then developed into all this diversity, points of difference, varieties, regionality, personalities in the trade. And those were all kind of aspects which certainly spawned, the young guns who are not so young anymore, but there's always young guns coming through. And looking at, this heritage and what it means to these young students at Elsenburg and stuff, which I love going to lecture and talk to the new students. And, there's always a new generation of young guns. But I'm so pleased that our not so young guns anymore, the Duncan Savages and the Sardis and the Mullinoes and that, they are really taking a industry leading role, and they are driving a lot of programs forward. So that's great to see. I mean, certainly our cultural affinity with our main markets, certainly in Europe and the UK, but also, with America and, so, just even the language, and certainly across Europe with sport. I mean, it was, it was a great help in kind of getting people to look at the country differently. And, certainly tourism has got to be, over the last 2 decades, one of the greatest helps for getting people to the country, getting people eating the food in these great restaurants, seeing the country, experiencing the scenery, but also getting to know what assets the people themselves were. And we could do this coming back because we had these fabulous estates, fabulous wineries, a great culture of visiting wineries and tasting wines and wine routing, as they call it. Yes, it exists in Napa and that, and a bit in Oregon and Washington and stuff, but it's, it's very difficult, so if you take Australia, there's not a massive wine routing heritage. There's a lot of cellar door sales, but it's such a large, expansive country that other than going up to the Hunter Valley from Sydney for a day trip, it's really a difficult concept to sell. Somebody's not just going to fly to Adelaide or to Barossa or something and then go down to Coonawarra. I mean, these are massive, expansive regions that are very difficult to promote on a kind of tourism wise. So we've had this great asset and tool of tourism and incorporated into our heritage. I mean, coming back to the main thing of resistance, I mean, there was resistance on almost all fronts back in the day, but nowadays, I would say we're so spoilt that there's so much goodwill and affinity for the wines from South Africa that I really do feel for the Chileans and the Argentinians. Often it comes back to people saying, well, what is our calling card? Is it Chenin? Is it Pinotage? Is it, is it Cabernet from Stellenbosch? Or, what is our calling card? And I think our calling card, in my experience and for my customers, is the unique selling point of our diversity of quality, and how we can, because who do we hold up as the greatest nation of winemaking in the world? Of course, France. And what is France got? It has diversity. It has the Loire with its lovely Chenin and Sauvignons. It's Cabernet Franc. We've got Bordeaux with it. We've got Burgundy. And each area champions its own kind of unique selling points and its unique heritage. And I think we have that, and we've developed that and championed it across South Africa now, which you may think is just, well, that's great. But Australia actively fought against this 10, 15 years ago. People lost their jobs in these generic bodies because they tried to promote regionality and as a kind of trickle down effect for let's promote these unique wines from these unique regions, the top quality, and then the trickle down effect to halo will help sell the brands, who inevitably contributed, the large funds for generic marketing. But they went backwards on that message and went back to the generic message of brand Australia, and they lost a decade of sales, of goodwill, of moving the category forward among certainly quality fine wine consumers. And 10, 15 years later, they went back to that message post crash and said, guys, this is not working. We need to diversify our offering. and now it's much more of a unique, I'm going to say they copied South Africa, but it's much more of it's similar to what we do in promoting regionality, even kind of micro regions, and then also varieties within those regions that do well. Certainly, I can't really put my finger on specific areas of resistance. I think there are areas which are a little bit tricky where we would like to have maybe a few more brands that are sufficiently high enough quality to interest consumers above the kind of supermarket multiple grocer level and going into the more high street. But I think, we've just seen Christian write about the Rudeberg 2019 and give it 90 points. We've been, I never touched any of these brands for a long time because I just didn't think they were good enough. And but we have been selling that wine for now about 4, 5, 6 months, and we've done incredibly well with it at a kind of accessible price points. And we've started to sell bigger brands like Boschendal again, things like Simonset for the last couple. And those were things I would never touch. You would have to go to your local kind of South African biltong shop, and they'd have a shelf of those kind of brands that I call the locals drink kind of. But that's all changing because the people behind have realized that the quality of those wines now has to be there. It's a great heritage to have those brands and to have such a long history of those wines. And not long ago when I bought a bunch of the Boschendal Cabernet 17, the new Cabernet they did, we opened a 78 Cabernet from Boschendal, and it was still absolutely fantastic. And I said, how many producers who can have these bigger brands, have the heritage out there, even some of these old KWV wines, old Niederberg wines, and for me that's a very important part of our heritage, which all leads, I think I've got some interesting thoughts on Pinotage, but I'm sure we'll get to that. But for me, it remains, our strongest points still remain in my end of the trade, kind of more fine wine end of the South African wine brands, is we have this incredible authenticity because of our history and where we've come from and how we've grown out of a new industry, out of post-apartheid. We've had to be incredibly honest, incredibly authentic, and have quality will always be the overriding factor, but we've got that. The incredible stories of people and how they've, the brands and the brands that inspired them or their parents or their great grandparents in our history, going back to the 50s and 60s. And now we've got a real point of difference, many points of difference. Some people say that's negative. From my end of the trade, I'm not selling supermarket brands and just want Chardonnay, Merlot, Sauvignon. I want points of difference. I want diversity. And that's what really appeals to my fine wine buyers. The collectability, obviously scarcity, which some kind of almost ties back into that estate system thing where there's limited production, but high quality, but there is finite and it's scarcity, and then certainly for the red wines, undoubtedly, it's an old cliche, but our classical structure of our wines, and I think with global warming and the heat, just droughts and stuff, people are picking earlier, so almost alcohols have become have remained important and are probably coming down in the brands that I see, which were easily always 14.5. A lot of them now 13.5, 13.8, which is incredible to see because the wines I think are better wines for better freshness, better acidity, lower pHs, which all leads into being, generally speaking, if they're well made, much more ageable wines. And any wine, fine wine, needs to have a certain amount of ageability for me. So it's this cultural affinity, I think certainly with the UK, as our biggest market. I think Michael's article was interesting about America, but having lived there and studied there and traveled there a lot, the problem with America will always remain that it's 50 countries patched together. The 3-tier system doesn't make anything easier. you know, you could spend the entire WOSA budget in just one state, and then you'd have to do it 50 times differently across all 50 states. It's an incredibly difficult market, but an incredibly interesting market. And my other kind of thought on the American market and how it's so difficult to sell our kind of what our story and our heritage there and make it give it traction is that every 50 states practically makes wine. And obviously California is massive, but New York and the Finger Lakes and all that's growing massively as well. And when you don't want to buy that, what would your go-to wine be? I would say I would want to buy French wine. You know, you don't want to just buy more sweet, fruity critter wines. You know that didn't end well for Australia. But you know, the natural flip side of the coin for American consumers is if you're not going to drink a nice Napa Californian Cabernet or Central Valley Zin or something, you're going to want to try something interesting from the culturally diverse Europeans, you know, and we have to somehow worm our way into that mindset that we should be part of that that alternative for Americans. But in the UK here, we're in a very, very healthy position, and it's made my life very, very easy of late. But it had, you know, I've earned that. It hasn't always been easy.
Yeah, sure. I feel like, I mean, I have been wanting to talk about pinotage a little bit. I feel like we're going to run out of time. It's almost like, isn't that a microcosm of the story of pinotage? That we may have to skip that over because I just want to hear. Yeah, yes.
If I can make one point, and maybe Michael or Rosa or somebody can very quickly on pinotage. From a fine wine consumer point of view, it's whether it's Beersla or Black Label or kind of, you know, all these, it has struggled to get traction because the people who by and large buy it, however fine they are, whatever the price it is, tend to be still the fine wine consumers who are still buying a fine Aussie Barossa or a big Napa Cabernet or so. They're not the kind of people who collect Bordeaux and Burgundy and the Rhone and stuff. So that's the one problem. So how would you change it? How would you make it collectible? The only way that I can see in the short term and would be you would need to recruit one or two brand champions, and they would have to be our top one or two producers. If Evan Sardi made a pinotage like he did with Emil Ross for the Cape Wine Auction, which I've drunk both versions with not just tasted but drunk both bottles, and you would have to have a brand champion like that who people would say, but if he does it, then it might be worth looking at. And I can tell you, if you then said, right, here's the allocation of Sardi Old Vine Pinotage, it would sell just as quickly as Skurfberg and Footpart and Trainspoor and all these other things. I guarantee it. It would almost transcend the variety because that's what these producers do. You know, if you had a Duncan Savage making it or a Lucas von Lochrenberg, that's what pinotage needs now. To take it to a fine wine consumer, and until you can make all the great pinotages you like in light styles to Pinot Noir styles to Duckfoot styles, you can do all you like, but it's gonna be always still tricky to sell with fine wine consumers until you've got some irrepressible brand champions making collectible wines that people just cannot say to, and wines that will inevitably be highly allocated.
Well, Michael, I'd like to ask whether you think pinotage, just as a cultivar, actually has the sensory qualities to be able to be a world-class red that could sit alongside our Syrahs, which haven't really been mentioned, and also our Cabernets? Or do you think as a cultivar it's going to struggle? Because Greg's point about brand I think is very valid, but I just wonder if it's actually got the stuff in the fruit itself.
And I think, and it will probably surprise Greg, we are definitely agreeing here, but some of the point that needs to be made is that internally we treat pinotage, or the pinotage lovers treat it as a collectible, and the producers make it as a collectible. And that doesn't make it easier for people outside the lager to get inside the lager and access the pinotage that does exist. If you look at the parents of pinotage, the Sanso and Pinot Noir, we're talking about delicacy, finesse, fruit. We're talking about a lot of things that aren't generally being made as a stylistic statement. And the serious pinotage producers are double oaking, are concentrating the fruit, are chasing, if you like, for lack of another word, a kind of Barossa Shiraz style, which works perfectly for making cult and icon wine. But if you only have cult and icon wine, and if the people who are making it are rubbishing the everyday drinking version, it becomes very hard to convert that into a category outside of South Africa that is capable of doing the job we wish to see it do. And the same, to be completely clear, would have happened if we were only making collectible Chenin Blanc. The extraordinary versatility of Chenin Blanc has contributed to its success. And so, yes, I think pinotage has the attributes it needs, but it does need to be championed, as Greg has already said. And I think that championing is not just with the sort of obvious team leaders, but they need also to take a view that we need to make it a wine that is accessible to the wider wine drinking world.
Would you not say part of the challenge is that with Chenin, we have masses of vines, and even with Colombard, we have a huge number of hectares of vines, whereas pinotage less so. And that might be part of the problem for delivering good value middle tier wines, which is, I think, what you were saying.
Not at all. We've got a lot of pinotage. It's not as if pinotage is in short supply. What we need is drinkable pinotage and lots of it. And that's much more stylistic than it is viticultural.
Okay. So Siobhan, you've listened to a lot of people arguing about or debating what exactly South Africa represents and what we've inherited, but you don't get to leave it as an academic experiment. You actually have to go out there and spread the message. And I would love to hear your thoughts on everything that's been set up to now, but the question to you is, in a world of finite resources and kind of finite bandwidth, there's only so much attention we can get to get our marketing messages across. How do you choose where to apportion budget to your marketing efforts? I mean, we've had discussions over the UK versus the United States. How do you decide where the messages get punted?
Firstly, I'd just like to say it's been a very interesting discussion, because I work on 5 points of uniqueness in terms of messaging, and almost every one of them has been mentioned in this discussion. So it's actually great to see the alignment and how important that is. But in terms of exactly that, you don't have a lot of budget. Where do you market and where do you look to? We have a twofold strategy, which is really looking at what your base is, where we have been and where our affiliation has been, but also where do we look to the future. So we are, a main part of our strategy right now is actually looking to the future. So we are spending the majority of our budget in the USA, in China and Africa. But at the same point, our volume still comes from Europe. I think about 60% of our current value comes from Europe as well. So we need to continue holding that, but importantly, grow value over volume in the UK, in the European markets. And we only have 4 markets, be it 3 in Europe and 1 in the UK, in our sort of traditional markets. So, much to what people say, we actually are spending a lot of time and effort in the US, in China, and to a certain extent in Africa as well. But Greg mentioned that the complexity of the US, for instance, you've got 50 countries in one, so you have to be very focused, and it's a long-term haul. And then in terms of the messaging, you need to look at the last stage of the market. How much do they know about South Africa? How much do they know about South African wine? In some markets, they don't know those, so it's about educating on the basics and really pulling out your uniquenesses. In other markets, it's the style of wines they drink. The discussion on pinotage is very interesting, yet it's one of our draw cards in China. They're loving our pinotage. They're loving the versatility of the different styles. We've had many discussions where they're cooling the lighter styles of pinotage and drinking those. So it is very much about looking at a model that works on life stage and also on affordability.
So you did mention, you said that all of the 5 points of differentiation have been touched on. Can you go through those points for us?
Yeah, well, it's a nice summary. You know, one of the things we always say is South Africa is very diverse and exciting. We've got diversity in race, in culture, in gender, terroir, varieties, and we've spoken a lot about that. So that's the first thing we always talk about. We can't shy away from it. That's what we are. You know, whether it's cool climate, a cooler region, warmer region, you know, Sauvignon Blanc from Constantia being very different from Sauvignon Blanc from Durbanville. So you've got that constant discovery that can happen. We touched on old world. Yes, we're old world, but we've got this new world innovation. So our heritage comes along, and that's very important in some markets. In the East, heritage is incredibly important. But there's this new world energy and innovation that's coming through. South Africans are very strong innovators. You know, you've got the Old Vines project that comes through that pulls the heritage with it. Then you've got leaders in distinctive varieties. We've spoken about Shilan. Shilan is really a strong calling card for South Africa around the world. And then we've got Pinotage, probably less so than Shilan, but there are areas where it really is working well. Wine tourism. World-class wine tourism offerings. We talk about that. We have to bring some people to South Africa. And Jason, we really invite you to come and visit us, please. I promise you, once you've been here, you will go back and be an ambassador for us. So we're exciting, we're unique, and we've got premium experiences. And that's how we build ambassadorship overseas. And I think the one thing that has been touched on but not really spoken about is our certification and responsible production. Sustainability is a big theme around the world, and it's 360 sustainability. So it's about people, it's about place, and it's about prosperity. We've got the wine of origin scheme, which is critical in Asia because of food security. They want to know they can trace this product, that it's a genuine product. We've got Vita, which is our own ethical trade association, which is really gaining ground. 71% of our wine production is Vita certified. So I think that's very important. These are the things we talk about, but we'll dial it up and dial it down depending on the audience and also the life stage of the market. So that's that in a nutshell.
And does Vita, are there any plans to get Vita to implement some sort of training requirements for, I mean, given that we've been talking about diversity and about our heritage and our human heritage and the fact that craft is such a big thing, don't you think that there is merit in saying, well, actually, this certification should also talk to the fact that we value our workforce and upskill them to produce better wines?
Most definitely. It actually is part of the Vita program. Quite a bit of their budget goes into training and upskilling. Obviously, it's not technical to the nature, I think, that Rosa is talking about. But I mean, I fully support what Rosa is saying and what Michael is saying as well. I think that is the key to our future. But there is a component in Vita in training, and they find that's very important because you have to educate your workforce to be able to work with them. And I think equity is in all aspects of life. It's about education. It's about a fair wage. It's the way you've been treated and how you're exposed to things like chemicals as well. So most definitely. Great, thank you, Siobhan.
Evan, if I can turn the conversation to you, you're the head of international exports for Vinimark, and Vinimark is a fairly big exporter of South African wine. I wonder if you could tell me what are the biggest drivers of export demand? Are they the cultivars or are they growing regions? I mean, what is it that people ask for?
Jono, sorry, just interesting debate again, and maybe to what Rosa said earlier that we wouldn't be interested in the vineyard side. Certainly am, probably more so than the commercial side, and that unfortunately the dichotomy of those two that you just put in front of me, unfortunately price and distribution still plays a major role when it comes to growing demand. You know, I'd love the cultivar and region to be far more focused, but maybe it's important that I sort of talk in two different levels here, because you know we operate on a premium sector with our premium portfolio. And we've also got, as Michael referred to, you know, the floor pricing and industrial wine. And those commercial wines are always difficult because it's basically treated like a global commodity, as we've mentioned. You know, you're up against north of Spain, Italy, you know, these countries, South America, Australia. Viticulturally, they're fantastic to produce mass wines quite easily. We're up against it where we don't have enough sustainable trade deals. We don't have government help as far as subsidization that all these other countries do. So that base level was a very difficult market to operate. We've got our hands tied behind our back. That said, more often than not, when we are getting inquiries from very non-traditional markets like Kazakhstan or Mongolia, invariably it is wine importers looking for a Chenin and a Pinotage from South Africa. So it's quite interesting to see that those varieties are getting traction internationally. And that said, probably more traditional markets like even like the UK, take the UK for instance as probably our biggest export market. The basic on-trade, if you're looking at the most basic form, call it your local pub, and they want to offer a South African wine by the glass, invariably they're looking towards Chenin and Pinotage. So there is a sort of, call it that demand, it is driving around those two cultivars, which is good. But fortunately, the top end, the premium side is far more nuanced. We know that whether you be consumers looking for premium wines or gatekeepers, Greg, probably a good example on this call, you're looking at far more of the intrinsics as opposed to price and things like that. So you're looking at area, region, soil, you name it, and more of the intrinsics, which is good. And I think that's probably where this conversation has been centered for the last hour and a half or hour and 15. I'm very conscious of time, which is healthy, I think, for our industry again, because I think that's the level where we can kind of build resonance in brands. It's important.
I mean, there is the assertion that that they're two completely different conversations, but don't you think that there is merit if the champion brands in the premium tiers speak the same language as the cheaper brands? I mean, I think it's interesting that, for example, we can have these famous Stellenbosch cabs and famous Chenin Blancs, but yet at the lower end, or even famous Syrahs, but at the lower end, we're not necessarily sending that same message. It's like Pinotage pops in at the low end, but Cabernet doesn't. I mean, is there not something to be said for using the branding of the premium in order to allow the mid tier and lower tier to perform better, or is it really just price on those lower?
I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I think you'd actually probably look at the Australian example where they ran into difficulty. They kind of built it on the premium Barossa, big bold Shirazes, and then one by one consumers sort of say, well, why am I paying that amount for if I can get the same big bold intrinsics at the lower end? So I don't think we can, particularly in this country, because of our diversity, look at that in a cultivar kind of perspective. I mean, if you had to look at sort of our base level wines, maybe just to talk about what we do sort of from a cultural point of view, our biggest exports are Chardonnay, Chenin Blanc, and Cabernet. And that's by volume. So that must probably be bookended by the fact that those three are all listed in either Swedish or Canadian monopolies where the volumes lie. So I think that's quite important.
Okay. And where, I mean, are there particular areas right now that you're seeing big growth in, whether it is cultivar or region?
Yeah, I mean, I think our most exciting area of growth is on the premium side, which talks to what we've been discussing, and that's exciting for me as a business. If we were getting exciting to compete against everyone else around the world that could produce for cheaper and easier and geographically closer to where the major markets are, I'd be a little bit worried about where we are as a country. So I'm excited that our growth areas are all on the premium side. When I say premium, I'm probably talking about wines that retail for about $25 and up. So I don't know, in our little portfolio, I think Chocolate Block, Boekenhout's Kloof, wonderful projects like Porceleinberg and Reinecker, which really speak to some really interesting viticultural projects that we're involved in. And that's, to me, where the kind of the big growth is. On the premium side, I spoke about the cultivars and where they are. Interesting enough, actually, our fourth biggest, if you had to put cultivar to it, is Natural Sweet. And it's going to be a debate for another side, in another conversation. But I think I always find the Natural Sweet conversation quite interesting. And I think in the context of today's conversation, today's theme on heritage, I don't think we can write it off too easily. I mean, given the role that off-dry wines have played in our country over the last 50 years. It's before my time, but when Stellenbosch Farms Winery launched Lieberstein in 1959, within 5 years, it was the biggest selling bottled wine in the world, and that was an off-dry off dry Chenin Blanc. So, I mean, it's a funny project. I've been reading about it recently for some reason. And not only was it the epitome of style and sophistication, as they called it, but they made about 32 million liters of it. It was twice the size of Blue Nun, which still exists. So, you know, these kinds of wines have played a massive role in the history of our country. I'm certainly not saying that we as an industry should wholly look to start to make semi-sweet wines, but I think we've got to look at it in the kind of the context of where international markets are and where we want to be selling wines.
I mean, that's the trick, isn't it? Because sustainability from an economic perspective is very much part of the conversation. But yeah, thank you for that, Ev. So Jason, sorry, I know you had your hand up earlier and I actually completely overlooked that, but I wanted to go all meta and get you, having listened to a whole bunch of South African wine experts thrash things out. I would love to get your insights on our insights, you know, given all the thoughts and ideas that you've heard. You tell stories for a living, right?
Yes, I was going to say that. I was saying, you know, we talk a lot about education, but is it really education? I think sometimes we talk up here among our crowd, the wine crowd, and then we talk to consumers down here, and it's a mistake. And I think, you know, I mean, it's not really about education, it's about storytelling. And what kind of story do you want to tell is really the question. Do you want to tell a simple story or a complex story? And I think, you know, the story of, you know, Argentine Malbec, for instance, very simple story. It's not a very interesting story. And I think, you know, it struggles, you know, at the higher end. And I think if you want to sell wine in the US over $20, that's a very specific person that's buying that wine. And they know a lot about wine. They know a lot more than I think people give Americans credit for knowing. We know a lot about wine. I mean, you know, at this level, if you're selling $20, $30+ bottles of wine, and people want to hear a complex story. I mean, one of the successes of Loire Chenin is it's a specific type of Loire Chenin. It's dry Chenin. It's dry, you know, organically, biodynamically farmed Chenin specifically. People know a lot about it. They know the difference between Montlouis and Vouvray, between Sauvignon and some cheap, sweet, you know, whatever. You know, and there's distinctions. And I think that like a lot of that story about South Africa, people don't know in the United States. Like a lot of the things that Rosa was talking about is amazing. You know, that old vine Chenin and the clones that only exist in South Africa. I mean, that's a story that people that would help people really, you know, see what's going on. I mean, I think Chenin Blanc, I keep coming back to that because I think Chenin Blanc is a great grape to tell a story because it's so expressive of terroir. And as Rosa was talking about, and I think, you know, in order to sort of move beyond like the kind of the cheap and easy wine discussion, you know, people need to know, you know, different regions, different, even to the level of different vineyards. And I think that, you know, when you're choosing which story to tell, which way to go, I think it's hard to tell a story about everything. You know, it's like when you wrote a term paper in college, you know, in your literature class, you know, the teacher always said, you know, be specific, be narrow. You can't in a very short period of time, you can't tell a story about everything. And I think that's where, you know, like, you know, so in Loire Valley, for instance, that, you know, the story that's being told right now is about a very specific type of producer. Austria, you know, when it was having its revival in the US, you know, they chose a very specific path, you know, high-end Gruner Veltliner, and they appealed to certain people. And so now wine consumers know the difference between the Wachau and Comtal and Burgenland, and, you know, and I think based on that, then other grapes were you know, so once people knew Gruner Veltliner, then it was like, okay, now we'll try Blaufränkisch, you know, now we'll try Zweigelt, whatever it was, you know, and I think maybe, you know, jumping to Pinotage maybe skipping a step along the way, you know, promoting Pinotage in the US, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's just so I guess there's a type of wine storytelling that's different. I mean, we've had in the US now, I mean, we go back to the 80s, we've had almost 30 or 40 years of wine education. You know, if you're a high-end wine consumer, you've had a lot of wine education. you know, and now it's about like more specific, more complex types of education. So I don't know. I mean, that's sort of, I wonder, I think these kind of the deeper conversations, you know, I think we shouldn't be afraid to have them with consumers.
Rosa, I think you had some thoughts in response to that. Am I right? Or you're muted, Rosa?
You have to unmute. Yeah.
So there you go. Can you hear me? Jono?
Yes. If I can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Now, I see that there was a question. If you want me to answer that question, on the question list, there was a comment. I see it's been taken off now. It was about training. I would like to answer that question if possible.
Oh.
Yes. Sorry, Jason. Yeah, Rosa, please answer it.
Sorry, Jason. I don't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to answer the question. The question, Petrus Bosman from Bosman Vineyards and Wines commented that Vinpro trains 900 pre-COVID, 900 people annually. And that is people are very well trained by Vinpro. And I agree with that. I've done the Vinpro courses myself. I've been promoting it for years. And that's exactly why, one of the reasons why I believe in training. But 1,000 people a year is not enough. There's 36,000 people in the vineyards in South Africa, according to Vinpro. Or in the wine industry, I'm not so sure of their figures, that I understood it correctly. But even if it's 36,000 in the wine industry, the majority of that would be in the vineyards. If you only train 1,000 people a year for a one-day course a year, one vineyard worker in his lifetime will have one-day course in his lifetime. And for me, I don't see that will make a difference. So if you can have those courses and expand on them and make them more and just multiply it throughout the industry, I think that's the way to go. Thank you.
Sure. Jason, I just wanted to pick up on what you said about pinotage being a step too far. It's possibly echoing what, or in agreement with what Michael was saying about the fact that competition is a good thing. And I know because it allows people to see different expressions of the same thing. And just like people can debate, products themselves can debate with each other within the market. And I think that's something that needs to happen more for us. But I know we are running out of time. Are there any sort of parting comments that members of the panel want to make into anything that has been said thus far? No. Yes, Evan.
Well, can I just comment on something, what Jason said about education and storytelling? I think this is where we're at a really exciting time. He said, you know, for 40 years, people have been educating in the USA and trying to tell these stories. It's become a lot more difficult to tell stories. You know, over those years traditionally. What we've got now is we've got access to information at our fingertips, which is fantastic. You know, and I think what we're seeing in the consumers are really taking this on. Michael mentioned those kind of, again, those base brands in the UK. We've seen it in a couple of different ways on how having information in your fingertips, consumers are becoming very curious, which is really, really great to see. You know, we all know those stories of walking through UK supermarkets and you don't recognize a single wine that you used to drink back at home if you're a South African, because they've all been bulk shipped over and bottled somewhere and they've got a picture of Shaka Zulu or the Big Five on them. Consumers are looking into these wines now, they're picking it up and they've got apps like Vino and they're trying to work out, is there any authenticity to this? You know, is this an estate? Is it an actual real wine that exists, or is it just here for me to take? And I think things like Vino also play a really interesting role in this kind of curiosity. Just while we were online here, I wanted to have a quick look to see where, how many wines have been rated by Vivino, because I know traditionally, some of the traditionalists might not like Vivino in a conversation, but it's crazy. I mean, over the last 12 months, Vivino they've got 2 billion bottles scanned and 200 million ratings on their app as a wine app that's only been around for a few years. In the last 12 months, over 1 million bottles of South African wine have been scanned, which is really, really good. And it's exciting too. You've obviously got to look at where these kinds of apps are popular to see what's getting scanned. But the top 10 list of scanned South African wines, which is interesting for context of this conversation, are Spear, obviously Vivino is largely a Danish app and Spear is massive in Denmark, so that makes sense. But Nederburg, Boekenoot's Kloof, which will include Porcupine Ridge and Wolf Trap and Chocolate Block, Kamala, KWV, Kanonkop, Boschendal, Rustenburg, Amaranta, and Barista. And to me, just literally looking through that list now, it's great to see so many heritage producers in South Africa that have been around that are on that list of the top 10 scanned South African producers, especially considering something like Vivino is, you know, millennials, it's tech, it's all this kind of thing. It means people are embracing the older brands. And maybe to touch on the, call it the pinotage, you know, out of that list, Barista is quite interesting because it's the only single-minded pinotage proposition. And it just shows that people are, I'm speaking of two hats here, I acknowledge we're part of it, so this is certainly not a brand punt, but I was surprised to see it on the list and quite encouraged that people are drinking a single SKU that is a pinotage, and they're scanning it enough to make it, to put it into the top 10 list of South African wine scans. So that's exciting.
Yeah. I suppose it could also tell us that the big brands have very good distribution, which is I think going to be part of the importance of sustainability. But let's kind of draw it to a close. We started out, I thought Jason made an amazing observation that some of the wines that have really been popular have grown popular through a connection to the culture in the cities in which they are popular. I thought that was amazing. I thought, how are we going to do that? There aren't any South African, restaurants. But as Siobhan pointed out, the tourism that we have in this country is amazing. And I think that is our connection to culture, in that South African tourism is part of our wine heritage because it lets people come and see. And Michael outlined, the importance of craft and the fact that there is already global momentum behind notions of craft. We have a labor force that can deliver with authenticity on that, but it will never happen unless there's meaningful gearing up in the training of our viticulturists and our labor force. And of course, so we talked a lot about old vines and what they could tell us about our heritage, but listening to Jason just say what he found interesting and listening to some of the amazing discoveries that Rosa shared, I almost feel like the Old Vine Project itself is a little bit gem of heritage that is a story that should be told more and more, because it reflects, it's a magnifying glass on a whole number of aspects of South African wine. I almost felt like as things were being shared, that was a little keyhole that internationally people can look into South Africa because of the work, the internationally lauded work that the Old Vine Project is doing. And I think overwhelmingly it was this need for authenticity, I think through it all. And you spoke about that now, Evan, just that consumers are asking questions and they're looking more closely. So I'm not sure if at the end of 90 minutes we are closer to defining our heritage, but I just wanted to thank you guys, the panel, for sharing your time. Michael, for Rosa, for Evan, Siobhan, Jason. I really appreciated the way, and Greg, the way you guys have engaged with one another in robust debate. Now, for those of you at home who are still with us after 93 minutes, well done to you. You should be applauded. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I just wanted to remind you that there's a whole series of podcasts and webinars that are hosted by Vinimark, and they're available on the Vinimark YouTube channel. And the podcasts are also available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, as well as on the Vinimark website under the News tab. So thank you so much for joining us all today. Have a peaceful evening to the engineers in India. It's Engineer Day there, so happy Engineering Day to you. And thanks for joining us.